right, up next, we welcome Amy Radin. Amy is a former Wall Street executive turned innovation pioneer. She translates between technological possibilities and human needs to deliver real business results. As one of the world's first chief innovation officers at Citi, Amy doesn't just theorize about change, she's led it, creating measurable impact at companies like American Express, Citi, AXA, and with her clients globally. Her strategic advocacy methodology turns stakeholder resistance into organizational momentum where others hit roadblocks. Shaped by early lessons behind the counter of her father's neighborhood drugstore, Amy brings uncommon pragmatism to Columbia University classrooms and boardrooms alike. When your success depends on genuinely serving people, you quickly learn what truly matters versus what just sounds good in a meeting. Welcome to the stage, Amy. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Before I start, I just want to thank Jason for inviting me here. We have a long relationship, and he is amazing. And I'm so excited to be included in this session, and also to Justin and to Liz, who have really, true to the Zelle brand commitment, have made it incredibly easy for me to join you at the session, which I could tell you as somebody, I do a lot of public speaking. It is not often made easy, so I'm sure you know as well, so thank you. So we're going to talk about change, and just before we start, just by a show of hands, how many of you are experiencing or anticipating a high level of change at work and in your role as marketers? Okay, if you're not, I'm not sure you're telling me the truth, but okay. And how many of you currently or anticipate using artificial intelligence to improve what you're doing for customers? And is that an area where you might be running into some resistance, or let's call it challenges, lots of unanswered questions? All right, so we're gonna talk about that a lot today. And I just say, you know, change of the magnitude that we're living with now is, you know, on the one hand, being met with some people, I'm sure many of the people in this room who are involved in payments, such an exciting area, but also, so it's met with excitement and energy, but also it raises lots of questions. It raises lots of uncertainties, and the uncertainty stimulates, you know, call it pushback, call it questions, call it, you know, challenges that can feel like roadblocks. You know, it's resistance. And so resistance is no fun. And for me, as someone who's always spent my career looking ahead and thinking about like what's next and what's possible, I've run into lots of resistance. And so part of me feels like the subtitle to this presentation should be my advice to my former self. It's like all the stuff that I wish I had realized 20 or 25 years ago. But it's kind of my accumulated knowledge, and it's translated into this wonderful opportunity that I was given by Columbia University to teach an executive cohort in one of their graduate programs last year, where I actually built and developed a course on strategic advocacy. And we're going to talk about what that means. And in this presentation, I'll talk to you about, really present some tools that are part of that methodology, but not all of it. All of it would take 13 weeks times 90 minutes. So that would be like a lot of time. But if I convince you of anything in the next hour, it's that rather than seeing resistance as an obstacle, is that I can help you start to see how it's actually an opportunity. Because resistance is packed with insight. So we'll go through these 4 tools, but before we do that, I want to start with a story, which was something that, that my team lived through actually just 20 years ago, but a lot of it is still incredibly relevant as I talk to people who work in consumer financial services industry. And for those of you who've worked in or are working in lending businesses, you know, there's a long-standing assumption in lending business, in consumer lending, that the way to collect money from seriously past due accounts is to call people and, you know, make a collections call, and could be at dinner time, could be whoever knows when, to try to negotiate repayment terms with them. And my team, I was leading the digital transformation team at Citi in the early 2000s, and we had been going very systematically through the P&L to try to come up with ways. We'd say, well, what if we do something digital against this customer behavior or customer transaction, what would happen and how can we move the business? Because my colleagues were all about, like, show me the money, right? So we were looking for that. And we had made incredible progress on the P&L, a lot on the cost reduction side, big breakthroughs on new customer acquisition. And so at one point in our search for new ideas, we started to look at the balance sheet. And there was an opportunity there kind of staring us in the face, which was to impact write-off rates. And you have to understand, back at that time, our business generated $5 billion in income after a write-off of $7 billion. So our CEO used to call it a consumer give back, that we were doing providing an economic stimulus program through the level of uncollected debt that we forgave. And we said, like, wow, even a 1% improvement could be worth tens of millions of dollars. And now, as we were talking about at lunch, it's really hard to get 1%. You know, people may trivialize it in a meeting, but 1% is a really big deal. So we were, like, so excited. And we thought about, like, what must it feel like to be in collections? Because the fact is, most people really want to pay their bills. But bad things happen to good people. They lose their job. They run into a big unexpected medical debt, an unexpected auto repair. It's well known that the average American cannot afford a $400 car repair. And so something bad happens to them, and it's extremely emotional and embarrassing. So it's like, well, what about, rather than making that phone call, which is utterly embarrassing and just reminds them of the shameful feeling they're feeling, what if we create a digital experience that gives people the opportunity to renegotiate their payment terms in the privacy of, wherever, but, in front of their screen and not having to deal with the collector? We were so excited. We thought this was the most brilliant thing on earth. And we said, OK, our team goes running off to our friends in collections, who, by the way, were like amazing people. And we said, OK, we need a test file. And we immediately ran into lots of resistance. Now, why? Well, because the practice of calling people to establish payment plans was well established. The results were proven. It was a big number that could really jeopardize the business if we were wrong. And that got a lot of attention from the regulators, as you know. What are we going to do? So incredible resistance, which led to a lot of frustration in my team, because we thought we had something really amazing, a really big, innovative insight. And we actually kept going back for 2 years, because we had so much passion around the potential of this test and its impact on the business that we just would not give up. Or I should say, I would not let my team give up. I was like, let's go back. We have to keep trying for a test file. And so one day, they somehow figured out that there was a group of customers for whom we had no phone numbers. So it was kind of a no-lose situation. The skip trace people said, so it's like no lose. There was no way we could rock the boat on the existing collections process because they couldn't call them anyway. So we were allowed to do a test. And coincidentally, the test results came back almost at the start of the financial crisis. And the results were so stunning that the company hired one of the global consulting firms to rush out the results worldwide to all of our consumer businesses. And now, kind of the rest is history, because now this is not innovative. I mean, having online collections, it's a very, very standard product. But at the time, we were one of the first companies to do this. And this whole experience stays with me. And there are many, many other stories I could tell you. And I'm sure you have your own stories about when, you living along this, you following this journey of excitement to resistance to frustration to hopefully getting to a breakthrough so you can prove impact. I could tell you a lot of stories, but it had a really big influence on even how back then I started to think about what does it really take to bring a new idea forward and make change happen, especially in the kind of environment that you all operate in, where there is so much complexity, so many silos, a lot of risk management, compliance, regulation, legal, even your marketing colleagues outside of payments. In a function where everybody knows it's really important and it's high growth, where's the ROI? So I said, this has really a bigger impact. And before I go forward, yeah, Jason, I forgot that I have my drugstore story in there. Just a little context about me. I'm just the kind of person who thinks very differently. And in the interest of helping teams be more successful when the status quo no longer applies, I have a history, as people who know me will attest, to not being afraid to kind of challenge the status quo. And sometimes I've been more productive and successful than others. But I'm a big what-if person. You know, what if we tried this? And coming from a direct mail background, well, let's just try it. You know, you could always do an experiment and just see what happens. But my own journey had less to do with getting an MBA in Wharton or working for some great brands, which I'm really grateful for having had the opportunity to do. But it really did start at my dad's store, which is a little corner drugstore in Brooklyn that is no longer around, no longer sadly is my dad, where success really depended on understanding your customers. And you know, I used to see my dad in his home office at night. He was his own collections agency. And you know, if you want to support your family and pay college tuition and put food on the table, you really have to listen to your customers and have a tremendous amount of empathy and not treat all your customers the same way. You really have to understand who they want and who they are and what they want. So it wasn't a really big leap, crazily, as I worked more and more at the intersection of financial services and technology to see that the traditional approaches that we take to change management, going back to methodologies that the big consulting firms have been selling since the 80s, are increasingly inadequate for the complex challenges that we are facing today. And that's the second thing I want to convince you of today. And of course, the third is there's huge value to bringing non-traditional people into the mix. So that's just a commercial message that the more you bring non-traditional people in the mix and make it possible for them to be heard, the more you'll increase the likelihood of solving some of the challenges that you're trying to work on today and really build bridges across the organization. So I said I was going to use AI as an example today because it's so front and center. It's all my clients are talking about. I'm sure you're thinking about it. And you know, while there are lessons that we can take from my collection story and many of the other stories that I've lived through, and I'm sure you lived through, AI is pretty different. And what's fundamentally different about AI is that previous technological shifts impacted kind of our processes. Maybe we had to learn some new skills. You know, maybe there was some organizational changes. The thing with AI is it challenges not just our process and our skills, but it also challenges our identity. I mean, what's our value if AI can write copy, can analyze data, can generate creative concepts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the challenge. And that's why, you know, we've been talking a lot today about the emotional aspects of money. There's a lot of emotion embedded in winning support for the technological changes that we're trying to achieve today. And AI really brings that to the fore. And if I can offer just some personal advice, I think there are two things that you require if you're leading any kind of initiative where AI is kind of a piece of the puzzle. And one is, you obviously to develop personal fluency, which doesn't mean you have to become an expert, but you got to know enough to ask the right questions and to continually build your learning curve. But none of us can become experts. It's just too hard and changing too fast. So how do you develop personal fluency around AI? But the second is, how do you learn how to master, how to bridge this technology-human divide? Because that's what you're going to need to do for successful implementation of anything involving artificial intelligence. So keep that in mind as we talk, because I'm really going to talk about that. How do you bridge that divide is really the substance of the 4 tools that I'm going to talk to you about today. There was an interesting statistics published by Fast Company a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't look into their methodology, so I don't know, you know, I didn't dig deep into the statistical depth of this, but they published a stat saying that nearly a third of employees are resistant to AI adoption. So just think about that for a minute, a third. I mean, that's incredible. And there are lots of reasons for resistance, which could be a whole other conversation that we can have. But layer this dynamic onto the reality of the complexity of your day-to-day jobs, even without AI, and then that, you know, face it, we are entering an environment of, you know, potentially high economic uncertainty as people kind of prognosticate about what are the impacts of consumers around all the changes in Washington, and that will come back to all of us in our jobs. So it's almost like a perfect storm. that marketers are uniquely positioned to either become totally frustrated by or to help navigate. So how do we move beyond resistance, cut down on the frustration, and get to impact, right? And I'd say, again, it's by addressing that emotional journey between what's technically possible and and encouraging human adoption and acceptance. And the gap is not about technology. It's about our human experience. The technology people divide shows up in a lot of specific tensions. And I'm sure some of these are very recognizable to you. Personalization versus privacy creates real operational tensions. Automation, really disrupts expertise hierarchies that took years, for some people, their entire professional lifetime to establish. So these are not simple problems. They're very complex challenges. And maybe your agency or even your marketing team internally is facing this challenge. AI content generation and personalization tools are exciting, and they're igniting all kinds of possibilities around delivering incredible, creative, very personalized at scale. But they're also triggering existential questions for creative teams, either at your agency or internally. I mean, what's my role? Who's accountable? What about me? And the fact is, even the most brilliant and perfect technical solutions alone don't drive adoption. So I'm curious where your organizations are in this journey. So just by a quick show of hands, consider any project that you're pursuing that's involving a great amount, a better than average amount of change. Is there excitement in the organization? Is there resistance? No resistance. Yes, there's resistance, okay. Is there a little bit of all of these things? Okay, so that's not surprising. I mean, no matter where you are, the key is moving from seeing resistance as an obstacle to seeing it as a resource. So let's turn to the 4 recommendations I promised that I was going to pursue with you today. Starting with, resistance does not mean you failed. Resistance contains valuable information. And most change efforts start out by saying, well, we have to overcome that resistance, or we have to do an end run around that resistance, which I have to say, I encourage plenty of times, but that's a short-term game that does not really help when you want to build relationships inside your organization. We're going to take a different approach. We're going to learn to translate resistance or reframe it. And seeing resistance through the lens of opportunity may be able to help you create some strategic advantage. And as I said before, this is part of the work that I've done at Columbia in my executive course on strategic advocacy. And I think strategic advocacy provides a really interesting framework for inspired change leadership. It borrows from the tools of social activism to build coalitions that scale. And its methods, unlike influence, strategic advocacy is extremely intentional and clear against a specific goal that you may be trying to accomplish. It's focused on transformation opportunities, not incremental tactics or small time changes. And it's really appropriate for a world where decisions are increasingly made through networks, not through hierarchies. So the old world, and I know a lot of your companies are probably still struggling, between trying to operate hierarchically through the silos and top-down decisions get made and you're told what to do and blah, blah, blah. But increasingly, let's face it, how do things happen? Things are happening more and more through networks, and empowering innovation and real collaboration are really key ingredients to getting change to happen. So let's move ahead and take a look at 4 skills and mindsets. And so if the goal is to bridge this human-technology divide, we want to start by addressing the core challenge. So again, thinking about AI, but you could plug in here any big transformation challenge that you're facing today. AI challenges process and identity on top of a world where we're living with a level of, let's say a greater degree than average of economic uncertainty, which is kind of creating very unstable ground, even to implement technology as disruptive as artificial intelligence. And so to help you do that, we're going to talk about how can you see resistance as insight? how can you build coalitions using two methods, spectrum of allies and stakeholder chess? And finally, use what you've derived from translating what I call resistance statements into insights to start to work towards shared values. Because the thing about shared values is if you're able to agree on shared values in terms of what you really want to accomplish, you can get past even the worst implementation disagreements, which is usually where the resistance happens. Now, everybody wants to do the right thing for their customers, right? Hopefully, everybody wants to have an environment where all employees can do their best work. Everybody hopefully wants to have an environment where innovation is valued. So how do you get past those implementation disagreements? It's by really having a set of shared values. And I'm not talking about the having some value statement that sits in the coffee station on the wall or that, pops up when you, fire up your computer every day to your company intranet. It's about making your values part of the conversation. It's like, hey, wait a second, I thought one of our values is. So can we step back from this agreement and talk about how we can reach agreement that's consistent with our values? So it's making it an active part of the conversation and how you build relationships with your colleagues. So before we dive in, you really may have to shift your mindset from thinking about resistance not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a starting point for change. So the question is, who would you rather be? The person who sees resistance as an obstacle and is banging their head against a brick wall? Have any of you ever been here? I certainly have. I'm sure we all have. Or if you're able to see resistance as a starting point for change, it's the way to actually get momentum and have a breakthrough. So for any of you who are skeptics about making this mindset shift, there's at least 3 reasons that I'd encourage you to do so. First of all, resistance signals important concerns that actually may need addressing. Number 2, if you actually acknowledge the resistance concerns that are coming from your colleagues, you may be opening up the door to more successful implementation. And number 3, you'll just create a much more positive and constructive dynamic for change. And the 4th sort of unofficial reason is you will be a lot less stressed if you're able to see things like this. So how do you begin to change the conversation? Well, here are 3 resistance statements that I've heard recently from clients, and I'm sure you've heard lots of others. We don't trust AI-generated content, or AI is coming for our jobs, or compliance will never approve this. I'm sure nobody in this room has ever heard that statement. When you pause and listen and try to understand what is at the root of that resistance statement, and it takes a conversation. It takes really actively listening and trying to understand what's really going on here. You maybe go through a little bit of a translation and you think, well, what the person's trying to tell me when they don't trust the content is we really want more visibility into how AI is making decisions. Or AI is coming for our jobs. We want clarity on how our roles will evolve and support for skill building, right? There's so much fear around this. And one of the biggest reasons people are resisting AI is this fear about skills becoming obsolete. And I've seen data showing that companies are doing, on average, doing a really inadequate job on retraining people. And finally, compliance will never approve this. Well, maybe what you're hearing is we need to update our governance frameworks so we can have a different conversation about risk management. And so this kind of shift in understanding can really change the conversation from opposition to collaboration. So let's take a minute to practice doing this. So I'm going to ask you to maybe work with somebody sitting next to you, or you could work by yourself. And I would love it to get a volunteer after a minute. So think about this. Think about any resistance you've encountered recently or you expect to encounter when you get back to the office. How would you, so here's an example, the resistance I'm hearing is this is way too complicated. Well, maybe the translation is, well, we want to see a clear implementation plan. Think about something that you're hearing now or anticipate hearing that represents real resistance. And how would you make that into an opportunity statement that could allow you to further the conversation? So why don't we take a minute to do that? Okay, so even if you haven't completely formulated your translation, do you see a difference, in how the process of reframing might start to shift your perspective? Or just asking the question, what are they really trying to tell me? Anybody want to volunteer an example that they came up with? Should I call one of my friends from Zell? Okay, Jason, thank you.
Marketing.
Wait for the microphone.
Sorry, we can't say, I'm mic'd up, yeah. We can't say instant in our marketing, and so maybe the translated opportunity is we need to do a better job substantiating what instant really means.
Great. That's really good. Okay, anybody else want to offer one, or should we move on? I don't want to put any pressure on people, but hopefully you can see how when you even just stop to think about what are they really trying to tell me, and how can I reframe this as an opportunity or an insight that can help me. It's really small. It's a small step, but it's incredibly powerful. And you're in control of deciding, I'm going to do this, right? And no technical support required. Okay, so I want to talk about the second tool, which is this spectrum of allies. So spectrum of allies is a strategic mapping method that's used by community organizers. It recognizes that change doesn't happen through binary opposition. It's about moving people along a continuum of support. So people generally fall into one of these 5 categories, right? They're the active supporters or active resistors, passive supporters or passive resistors, or they're someplace in the middle. And most change leaders make the mistake of spending a lot of energy and a disproportionate amount of psychic energy and time trying to convert their active resistors. When the real leverage comes from investing effort in your active supporters, then activating passive supporters, then nudging along the neutral fence sitters, who, by the way, when people see a strong quorum of active supporters who have credibility in the organization and who are influencers, people will start to shift on their own. So the thing is to invest your energy in the active supporters. And in the active resistors, you've got to listen to them and find the insights into what they are trying to tell you. I used to say when I was back in banking, the problem with the kind of work, the challenge with the kind of work that we do is that on the one hand, it's like walking a tightrope. You've got to be incredibly stubborn and have the courage of your convictions, but you also have to be open to the possibility that people are trying to tell you something. And so that's what this is about. It's like really listening, because people will be trying to tell you stuff often that is useful. And so how do you figure that out? So one point I want to emphasize about spectrum of allies is that it's really important to be factual. So just because you think somebody doesn't like you or you don't like somebody personally, that doesn't make them an active resistor. So if you try to do this on your own, and I will encourage you at the end when I suggest some next steps, to really think about, try mapping your spectrum of allies and see what you can learn from that, is to be factual. So there should be some behavior, some concrete evidence that you can point to that says, that's where I think this person falls. And it's about people, not departments, right? You cannot brand an entire department as being actively resistant. That's like really unfair, right? So you want to really try to think about this. So be factual, don't guess. And it may be that you have a list of people who are like, I'm not really sure, and that tells you, I should really find out where they fall because they're in an important role or they're an important influencer, so I really want to figure out where they fall. So that's another question to figure out. And so mapping your key stakeholders based on behavior and interactions, real stuff that you have observed, building momentum with your active supporters, and with resistors, listen. Don't exert excessive energy into trying to convert them, because you will get more to happen focusing on the active supporters. So I want to talk about stakeholder chess, which is another way of understanding your stakeholders that works hand in hand with the spectrum of allies. So thinking about where we've come so far, translating resistance into insights helps us turn resistance into a resource and an opportunity, right? The spectrum of allies helps us understand who stands where in terms of support and where to focus our efforts. Stakeholder chess reveals how these people influence each other. So here's a hypothetical that I put together against no particular example. But you start by thinking about, who are my internal stakeholders? And by the way, also here you have departments, but I mean like people. If you generalize the departments, you won't really get any place with this kind of strategy exercise. Who are my internal stakeholders, and where do they fall in terms of their level of power and their level of support or opposition? And then who's influencing who, and in what way, right? And I just made this up. This is not against any real example. But when you start to do this, you may see, first of all, this acknowledges the reality that the organization chart does not really tell you what's going on. Okay, so people who say, oh, let's pull out the org chart and see who's making the decisions, that is generally not what's happening. Sometimes it is, but often there's a whole influence network that's going on where people are influencing each other. So really important to understand that. So secondly, you could have people, you could have, say, an active supporter who has connections to neutral stakeholders or resistors. And they could be really important to helping you pull people along to understanding sources of resistance. So it's kind of, again, a strategic tool to help you understand where do I spend my time and where is the dynamic behind the decision that I'm trying to get made or what I'm trying to build support for. So you want to look for a couple of key insights when you're doing this. One is the influence change that can help to move resistant stakeholders. Two is power imbalances that may require you adjust your approach. That's a nice way of saying, what if you have somebody who's extremely strongly opposed, who has a lot of power and influence? Well, you have to really think about that, right? And you've probably got to build some other alliances with people who can help influence that person, and you've got to listen to them. Third is, what are unexpected alliances that can bridge traditional silos across the organization? So then you can determine what actions can I take that will help me advance relationships and understanding and make progress towards the change goal that I'm trying to achieve. So the goal of stakeholder chess is really to acknowledge and understand, and especially for the Zell consortium, you're working in a very complex ecosystem. So for Zell as an organization and for you all in the payments functions of your financial institutions and for the resellers who are selling into these institutions, these are incredibly complex organizations. So taking the time to understand some of this stuff versus just barreling ahead or operating against the organizational hierarchy can really help diffuse tension and help you make progress. Like the spectrum of allies, which I think I forgot to point out there, this is not a static map. So it's the kind of thing that you want to, if you want to use this tool, you put it together, and then every couple of months, you really take a look and say, what progress have I made or what has changed here? So it's not static, but a good one-time exercise to get you started. So finally, you've shifted your mindset, hopefully, to see resistance as a resource. You've built your ability to translate resistance into an opportunity. You've mapped your stakeholders to understand their support, power, and level of influence. So next, you want to define shared values. And I said before, these are all the things that you can agree upon. And why do you do this? To create a foundation, because the values will transcend specific implementation disagreements, which is usually where the friction and blockers happen. So let's go back to the translation of resistance statements into insights, and then think about, well, how would some of these maybe hypothetically translate into shared values? So we had an insight from the first resistance statement that was like, well, we need more visibility. It's not that we don't trust AI content, it's we want more visibility into how AI makes decisions. Well, maybe for this organization, there's a shared value around we foster transparency and trust. So if that's your value and your resistance is coming from a lack of visibility, then it's like, well, that's an action you can take. How do we increase the level of transparency and trust so people have the visibility they need to buy in on the decision? Or we want clarity on how our roles will evolve and support for skill building. Maybe there's a value in your organization or one that needs to be defined and committed to around we support the role of human creativity to achieve breakthroughs that benefit all stakeholders. And this is not to say, oh, HR has to do that, I can't do this. If you're a functional leader, if you have a team of any number of people working for you, there's nothing to stop you from defining values within your team, how your team is going to operate. So you can't, it's inexcusable as a leader to punt to, oh, somebody else takes care of that. I take a hard line on that kind of, that's a cop-out. So, or the third one, we need updated governance frameworks for risk management, responding to, oh, compliance will never approve that. Maybe there's a value around, we adapt processes and policies to enable responsible innovation. I mean, does anybody want irresponsible innovation? Of course not. And so what role can you play, and is there a value in your group? And then, and this was one of the biggest challenges, and a place where I spent an inordinate amount of time when I was Chief Innovation Officer at Citi, was going back and challenging sort of processes that were developed for what I used to call industrial strength to guide decisions on tiny little innovation experiments that were like maybe we were testing something to a few thousand people. And it made a really big difference to even get people to understand or question the value of applying these industrial strength processes to small experiments, and how just doing that is kind of a knee-jerk reaction was in fact stifling our ability to make positive change and innovate and experiment with new technologies. So those are examples of how, how you can get from resistance to insight and from insight to shared values. So how do you figure out these shared values? Well, not by sitting alone at your desk, right? You have to derive these collaboratively, because just by deriving them collaboratively, by working with the people who you want to adopt the shared values, they will be more likely to be bought in versus presenting them to them. So to get moving, when you identify a stakeholder who's showing resistance, one thing you can do is say, what fundamental value might we both care about, even if we disagree on the approach? So that could be a real easy starting point, is just think about that, and then you can introduce that into the conversation. And it really can diffuse the tension and start to be applied towards making progress. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about how you put these tools into action. First of all, definitely start small with strong supporters based on shared values. So the idea is not to say, oh, wow, I'm going to roll this out to all of my projects. Pick something where you have a high chance of success, which means you've got a few active supporters who want to help you really move something forward. So start really small and focus on incremental wins so people can see that you're behaving differently as a leader and you're trying some new things. One thing to think about, I want to point out, is that these tools really all work together. So the cycle starts with his resistance statements as valuable inputs, right? Each tool builds on the other, kind of in a continuous cycle, So you translate insights from obstacles to opportunities. That actually gives you some raw material to at least start to understand and construct your spectrum of allies. Then your chess mapping can expose the power dynamics. And then you can get to shared values that actually give you a language to build bridges. And if you're able to apply this repeatedly, you sort of have an engine going that really changes the way you operate, that gives you a whole new approach to change management than the old tools that are no longer as effective as they had been in the past. So I'm going to come back to mindset, because what I've talked about today requires a new way of thinking. And I've always found marketing people are very open to new ways of thinking, which is why I proposed during this presentation to this group, and I'm very excited to bring it to you, because knowing the challenges, at least some of the challenges that I can only imagine you are facing, I thought this would be useful and provocative to help you with some of the things you're trying to deal with. And so as we wrap up, I want to be a little more specific about 4 areas where small shifts in your own thinking and behavior can really matter and create positive role modeling for people around you. definitely to capture those resistance statements. So literally write down, I'm not kidding, I mean that literally, what you're hearing before your own rationalization sets it, right? We're all like positive and constructive and can do, but really want to capture what's there so you can go back and think about what's going on versus, oh, they're just wrong, or they meant something else, or they were just having a bad day. Really capture those resistance statements. The second is to look for those hidden influencers, because the organization chart often misses the real power dynamics that are at play, and who the informal leaders are. And by the way, that's not a political statement in a negative or cynical way. I mean, you put two people together, you have politics. That's just the way it is. And so look for those hidden influencers, because they can be either incredibly helpful to you, or you need to start to think about how do you influence those influencers who may be highly resistant and can make it really hard for you to make progress. Third, I think optimism is a hallmark of any change leader. If you're not somewhat optimistic, you will be defeated, because a lot of people around you will be telling you you're crazy or you're wrong or no, you can't do that. But be honest and hope, and not hopeful in kind of a blind or naive way, right? So map your stakeholders based on their actual influence and power, not where you wish they were. And be factual, right? If you're not sure, just put them on a I don't know list and say, I really need to understand that, because they can really impact my success or failure on this project. And finally, one of the things that I think is most important is to seek other perspectives. So invite trusted colleagues to contribute to your mapping and to how you're understanding resistance statements for blind spot detections, because you're working in an area of such complexity with colleagues who are facing wholly different challenges and risks and opportunities. You really can't do this alone. So invite other people in to help you. So I really, obviously I'm a big advocate for, and I've seen this with my executive students and how they are all operating in their businesses now using these tools. So I have a little success sample to show for it, and this work is really resonating as I present it to other audiences like yours, that I think the use of these types of tools can really empower you to create more sustainable change. Whether it's your current focus on AI, getting support for an advertising budget, whatever it is, helping convincing your colleagues in risk to remove some of the limits friction on cell transfers, which I've personally encountered and I'm not in love with. Well, whatever it is that you're working on, think about how these tools can play a role for really difficult change decisions that you're trying to advocate for in your organization. It's just keep in mind that the path is not linear. This is really messy work. So this is a real couple of steps forward, a couple of steps backward, a couple of steps sideways, good days and bad days. And so, I mean, that's just the reality. It's not linear. It's very messy work. But every small win will help you build credibility towards what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that continuously listening will help you, and being very adaptable as you listen and learn new things will help you sustain momentum. So I want to summarize 5 key takeaways that I hope you will keep in mind as you're apply to some of the work that you're doing. Be sensitive to addressing both the process and identity impacts of AI, and remember that your success in this area is building personal fluency and also learning techniques to bridge that technology human gap, because that's what needs to happen to really get strong adoption, whether it's with employees or with your customers or with any of your other stakeholders. See resistance as a source of insight, not an obstacle. I think all of us do not want to be the person banging our head against a brick wall. So the key to being the other person is to really start to reframe resistance. Understanding your stakeholders, using those 2 tools, the spectrum of allies and stakeholder chess, to understand support, power, and influence. So really, you can prioritize where and how you're spending your time. I know you're all working really hard, and there's a million things you can do in a day. So this can be a great way to prioritize and help you see things that you might be missing. That could be really, really critical to you. Develop and actively use shared values. Don't punt to HR. If you're leading a team of any size, there is nothing that stops you from really defining shared values in your work group, in your cross-functional work group, so that you can move away from battling over implementation agreements. And let's focus on what we agree on and how can we find an implementation path forward. It's just something I think we would all much rather do than arguing. And finally, embrace your role as a strategic advocate. It's not about converting resistors. Real strategic advocates, translate the insights and see themselves as truly leading change, which I think all of you, given your roles, are in a position to do. So, in traditional change management, resistance and vision are locked in opposition, right? Resistance is this way, and vision is the other way. You're the visionaries, and resistance can really stop you. So it's sort of a 0-1 game where one has to defeat the other. So if you really think differently about resistance, you have the opportunity to really transform the dynamic and play the game better. So instead of being on opposite sides, these forces become more complementary strengths. And the game really shifts from confrontation to collaboration around your shared values, whereas resistance can strengthen your progress by revealing potential blind spots. And also, you'll be forced to test the resilience of your vision and what it is you're trying to accomplish. So, the white knight doesn't need to capture the black knight. They can work together to create a more powerful strategy. Also, resistance is not personal. I know often it can feel that way, and I've certainly had my moments of running into my CEO's offices and banging my head and being frustrated and sometimes to the point of tears. It's not personal, it's strategic. But you have tremendous power in reframing the conversation and being more thoughtful about trying to understand your stakeholders and where they're coming from. And by changing how you see resistance, you can really start to change the game. So I want to go back to my original story. We began with this story of transformation at Citi. And 2 years in, the resistance phase definitely felt like an eternity. And I think, were it not for my own personal stubbornness and my team's belief that we were onto something, we would have given up. But we were like the little engine that could. We just kept going at it. Like a lot of organizations, we were following traditional conventions of change management. We were focusing on overcoming objections, getting around the people who are putting obstacles in our path. And so the good news is that it bore the seeds of insight. We started to see, what if we stopped seeing resistance simply as an obstacle? We also got lucky when we discovered that skip trace file. So luck definitely can play a role. And so I wish I could say that this whole notion of strategic advocacy and how you apply tools from social activism into the corporate world just came, like a bolt of lightning. It didn't. It's been years and years of thinking and mulling and understanding what are the common patterns and how can you really make progress in this. And that's become a topic of incredible interest to me as I think about my own purpose at this point in my career, is to really support people like you, to take your tremendous expertise and continue to do the amazing work on innovation in payments and other areas of financial services where that's so critical. So my guess is that every organization represented in this room has some version of this timeline playing out. Maybe it hasn't been the 2-year timeline. Hopefully not. Hopefully you've been faster than we were. But what took me 2 decades almost to synthesize, you can now really start to apply as a structured methodology. So I want to end with, what are 3 suggestions to get you started? Whenever I present, I always want to leave people with, you're going to go do something. I'm very big on theory, but I've been an operator, so I'm very big on practice. So I have 3 suggestions, and I doubt they'll surprise you. Capture those resistance statements. So pay attention to those, even note the next 3. And then force yourself to do the exercise of, well, what's really going on there? And how can I translate each into an opportunity statement? And what's the conversation I can have as a follow-up to try to break through? Take the time to document your spectrum of allies. Focus on building momentum with your supporters if you're not already doing that. And really engage with them to build momentum among, this is about an adoption curve, right? So your active allies are the early adopters. So you start there, and how can you really intensify your efforts there to build momentum, while at the same time you're listening to the resistors. So that's what I have to say today. I think we have some time for questions. I would love to take questions and have some conversation, including if you think I'm totally wrong, but I'd love to be challenged. I'd love to take questions and hear from you on this presentation. Thank you. And I am very available. You've got my contact information here. Yeah, I'm very available if you want to follow up to have more discussion about this after the conference. I love hearing from people. Yes?
So I thought the stakeholder chess concept did a really great job of visualizing the nuance of different teams. Do you think there's a benefit or need to the traditional racing model, or is that something you believe teams should actively move away from?
A racing model?
Yeah, responsible.
I think all of these tools have a place, but I have to say I could think of one example of a consulting engagement I did a couple of years ago where there was blind adherence to the racing model, and they completely ignored the organizational dynamics, the influence patterns, the power. So I think it's interesting, but I think it's like blind adherence to any tool is probably going to forestall progress. But yeah, I wouldn't. I don't think it's a replacement, but I think it's an essential complement.
Hi, I'm gonna get a little bit into the weeds because I was
you're a data guy.
I was really, yeah, exactly. I was really fascinated by your case study around digital collections. It's interesting because this is something we looked at, and we were trying to create the same kind of change when I was at Amex during the pandemic. Amex does collections manually. The traditional, I think the legacy feeling is that customers want to have a human being, to want to interact with a person when during the collection experience. And we had a really hard time getting over that resistance hurdle. Mm-hmm. We actually just couldn't convince, because we couldn't find data that actually showed otherwise. And so I think unless something's changed since I left, there's no digital collection experience.
That's really surprising. And it's interesting because our team's hypothesis was that there were some people that absolutely did not want to talk to a collector. We just really thought about, and none of us have personally ever been in collections, but I've been in focus groups with chronic late payers, where, by the way, even though we recruited people who were new late payers, nobody admitted that they were delinquent on their account. So, it's a serious emotional issue. And there's a little bit of an orthodoxy in collections, or at least back then, that people who are in collections, they're bad. There's something wrong with them. So when they don't want to pay their bills. And for us saying, bad things happen to good people, and people want to pay their bills, and this is really emotional, we were never suggesting replacing phone collections. What we were suggesting was, what if we use digital collections in a targeted way as a complement to phone-based collections? And the incremental impact was astounding. Because there are some people are different. That's the other thing. It's you have to acknowledge the diversity and that this is a highly emotional issue. And emotions are not homogeneous, right? And I will tell you, by the way, that what started all of this work, we did no quantitative research. We literally, and I could think about, you would know the people who were in the meeting, Jason. we were sitting and looking at the balance sheet, and we said, that is a whopper of a big number. If we get 1%, it will be $70 million. And my colleagues always arbitrarily said they weren't interested in anything we were doing unless it was worth at least $50 million. So we said, wow, if we get 1%, they'll be happy. So, and then we just thought about the emotion. It was all qualitative based on our combined decades of experience in the industry. And if all you want to do is a very small test, you may not need to do a big research study beforehand. I mean, it could be a lot less expensive and faster to bootstrap a small test, even in a usability lab with wireframes, right, than to mount a big study. Maybe the big study is next to validate, but being open to different ways of validating and sort of saying, how big, what do we have to, what's at risk here? So how much do what do we really need to prove? And it's kind of a lot of what I learned from working with founders, because the other side of my life, one of the many other sides of my life, I'm an LP in an early stage fund. So I speak to hundreds of founders. And it was very eye-opening to me when I started doing work with founders to see that, like, wow, to figure something out, you don't need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can do things like you can just call some of your customers, you know, to get started. Because if your downside of that data, those insights not being valid is really low, and you don't have the capital, that's a good way to get started. And so being open to, sometimes we over-engineer things relative to the problem that we're trying to solve in the moment. So yeah, so I'm disappointed as a proud American Express alumna. I was there for 14 years. I'm very disappointed.
Well, thank you.
Their loss, but thanks for sharing that.
Oh, it's my turn. Hello, over here. How you doing?
Yes.
Thank you for this. I think this is awesome. I have actually a two-parter. One is because it just took me this long, even though we have a lot of use cases for resistance at Chase. But did want to share one internal one that just happened where I'm sure other people could relate, but we have to write our own controls, like our own procedural controls. And my team was struggling because the controls team says, we don't know your processes, and my team is saying, well, we don't know how to write a procedure. And so I tried to partner and to find a solution, but that partnership and that email I sent went to an escalation where I had to then de-escalate it and say, no, I think we can come to a solution. I was just trying to, make everybody's life a little bit easier. And the solution was, why are we not using we have something called an LLM, which is a ChatGPT solution to write a procedure. If we could just use that to help solution. And right off the bat, the control team was like, that's a great idea. Like, why did it take so long, to get here?
It's funny, as you started talking, what immediately popped into my head is that's a perfect Gen AI application. By the way, one of the tricks that I've been using, which not really a trick, it's a use of Gen AI that I'm finding incredibly valuable when I am going into one of these really hard discussions. I will my favorite tool right now is Claude. I like Anthropic. I think it's very it all depends on how you engage, but I have found really effective ways to engage with Claude. So I'll get on Gen AI, and I was like, I'm going to have this conversation with somebody who's really resistant to what I want to do, and I'll outline the whole thing. I go, how do I make sure that I have the right tone, don't get stressed out, learn these things, blah, 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 and unbelievably helpful to structure conversations if you set up the prompt in a way that's really honest to your goal. So just a suggestion. I have found it personally to be very helpful for some of the tougher conversations that I've had lately.
Does it create you as a person? That's what it should be. Like, maybe it could recreate you, like having that conversation without having to be you.
Right, and
like
I actually
an AI
also
version
have
of myself.
I have like an Amy strategy brief. So because Claude doesn't save things, it's not like ChatGPT. I'll say, by the way, here's my Amy strategy brief, so you know where I'm coming from and my overall, my context. And then I'll go in. But I have used it to help me structure conversations with resistors against the goals I want to achieve. And it's very, because I can go off the rails a little bit. I can become, I'm emotional about these things. I'm very passionate about innovation. And sometimes I'm like, well, why don't they see it? Well, that's not really fair. Not everybody sees the world the way we do.
And then just the second part is like, obviously resistance is one thing, but difficult, tenuous personalities is another.
Yes.
Do you have any advice for, especially where there's, I'm sure we all experience redundancy in our worlds, right? We have groups doing maybe the same thing and trying to re-engineer the RACI on like, well, you do this and I do that and it's different because, but then you get the resistance, but you get the personality on top of that resistance that makes it go nowhere. Is there any advice for that?
I haven't really thought about that's a really hard one. If I would say go back to listening for what's the source of their resistance and how can you get insights from that can help you move towards, a better conversation. And I would think with anybody these days that everybody has too much work to do. And so why are people, and what's behind that? Well, there could be fear. If I give away something that I'm supposed to be doing, am I more likely to make myself irrelevant, right? Which I would think is a big one.
Correct.
Right, because every day you read about more layoffs and people are just, there is a lot of fear. The AI is creating a lot of fear. And so I would say it's emotional. And so how do you get to the bottom of that? And I think part of it is building a relationship. I hate to say it, have a cup of coffee and where you don't talk about any of this stuff at all. Maybe this person has a big family problem. Maybe they have an outsized mortgage that they're sorry they took out. So maybe there's some other pressure. So I think try to build a relationship with them, not attach to the project, and get to know them as a human.
Yeah, thanks.
So it's stuff, and it takes time. And then you may say, well, I don't have time to do that. Well, I'd say, we don't have time not to do that, because in the end, the kinds of organizations that you're in, your expertise is not going to carry you, especially the more senior you become in an organization, the less it's about your expertise, and the more it's about your ability to lead through complexity, lead through disagreements, build relationships. Your expertise will, believe me, my expertise as a marketer had very little to do with what I was doing as a chief innovation officer, except that I was obsessively customer listening focused. Other than that, most of my time was spent building internal relationships so I could remove obstacles, take down obstacles from my team and build bridges so they could do the tests that we wanted to do. That had very little to do with what I trained for my entire career.
I can go next. Trying to make sure no one else has a mic. First of all, phenomenal presentation. Seeing kind of emotional intelligence put into a structure like this has been really eye-opening. One of my questions that I kind of reformatted as you were talking, if you're facing an opposition that, as opposed to just a lack of data that you need to overcome, maybe you're facing opposition that's more a subconscious bias, or that has kind of maybe pride related to it, how do you overcome things that people might not even know are oppositions? Is there like a sensitivity to reframing that to be productive that might be more sensitive than the lack of data route?
Is there a specific example? Because that's that's a little conceptual, even for me.
I work on the Zell brand, and so a lot of what we do is very subjective. And so it becomes kind of there's no right, there's no wrong. So how do you base decisions? And a lot of what we end up doing is focus groups and data-driven, et cetera. And so as we face oppositions, there becomes how do we stack rank these opinions in a way that feels true? That might be also overly conceptual.
I'd say you have to keep trying things, like go live with experiments and see what happens. By the way, to the comment that was made earlier, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, Jennifer's colleague. Sean. Sometimes you have to test to get the data. So there is no data until the purpose of the test is to get some seeds of data to help. Because the other big risk is that, you're surrounded by, and I'm sure all of you are too, incredibly smart people with tons of expertise. Well, your expertise, and I actually published an article, I'm a columnist in Fast Company, and I published an article about this last month, that how your expertise can actually become an obstacle, that people start looking in the rearview mirror for data that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're trying to do, but because it's black and white and stuck in a spreadsheet, it becomes real. And so we had a lot of challenges sometimes convincing people that we had to do a test specifically to get data, because we couldn't count on the historical data as robust as it was. It just didn't pertain to what we were trying to do. So I don't know if you're running into a little bit of that. But I think, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so when you talk about like subconscious bias, it's like, woo, I don't know where to go with that. But I think it's to keep digging to understand what is really driving the person. And again, really sometimes it could be something personal that's going on outside of the office. It's putting a lot of pressure on somebody. I mean, I've certainly seen that in my experience. But to really get it, maybe they're afraid for their job. Maybe they want a promotion. Maybe, there's something, or maybe they just don't understand. Maybe they just need to maybe provide more transparency around what you're working on and ask them what they think. I think we do a lot of telling and not a lot of asking. And one of the things we do in my course that my students love, we spend a whole class on better question asking. And if you're interested in this topic, there's a guy named Warren Berger who wrote a book called, I'm going to forget the name. Anyway, you can go to his website, warrenberger.com. He calls himself a questionologist. And his whole expertise, he calls it asking beautiful questions. And just how asking beautiful questions can actually help you negotiate for change. So we spend a lot of, they don't understand, so I'm just going to tell them. Well, that could be the really wrong strategy. The strategy might be, like, help me understand. I want to know a little bit more about, that's amazing. This is one of my favorite questions for founders when I think they're snowing me. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. How did you figure that out? Because founders want the check. So, you really have to dig. And so if you want to understand this topic of how do I ask better questions, and that might be a very helpful strategy for you, take a look at warrenberger.com. He's inspirational. He's really had a big impact on me. And my class was like, whoa, this is amazing. So, any more questions? Okay, well, I really appreciate all the questions, the engagement. Jennifer and I were talking at lunch about there's nothing worse than people not having questions or being engaged. Feel free to reach out. I love this topic, and I'd be happy to be helpful to any of you or your teams. And again, thank you, Jason, for hosting me. It means a lot.
All right, we're back up. Thank you so much, Amy. Learn something new every time we talk. So thank you so much.